Out on the edge of the Wild West, where dust and silence carried heavier than words, choices shaped men faster than bullets. This is not just a tale of pistols and prairie winds, it's a story about pride, temptation, and the price of one reckless step. She begged him to hold back, to stay true, but the warrior, stubborn and restless, chose otherwise. And in that single moment, under the burning sky, he lost not just the fight, he lost his soul. The Wild West was not just a place on the map, it was a feeling that lived in the air, a restless tension that held even the most fearless riders in its grip. The land stretched out endlessly, painted in dust and shadow, where the horizon itself seemed to mock the weary traveler. Silence here was not gentle. It was heavy, carrying the weight of lives lost, of duels fought under a sun that burned without mercy, of whispered prayers that rose only to be swallowed by the wind. This silence pressed down on every soul that dared to wander, a silence that demanded strength yet threatened to break the unprepared. The West shaped men not by their words but by the choices they made when no one was watching, choices carved into the dirt as deep as wagon tracks, choices that turned cowards into corpses and dreamers into legends. Out here, there was no room for hesitation. A single glance could decide whether you were a friend or a foe, a single twitch of the hand could spark the flash of a revolver, and a single wrong step could seal your fate. The land was vast, but it allowed no escape. The sky hung above like an endless judge, and beneath it every man's story unfolded like a chapter written in dust. The saloons smelled of whiskey and sweat, of desperate laughter masking fear, and of voices too loud for the silence outside. The horses stamped their hooves into the ground, restless as if they too could sense the weight of this place. It was a land where law traveled slower than bullets, where justice was not handed down from courts but from the quickness of a draw and the steadiness of a stare. The sheriff might wear a badge, but even his authority ended where fear began. Men carved their own justice, and each decision carved them in return. Every duel on a sun-baked street was more than a contest of skill, it was a test of soul, of who would flinch first, of who would be remembered and who would be forgotten. To live here was to gamble daily with the fates, and most lost more than they won. The West did not forgive weakness, but it never overlooked arrogance either. It demanded a balance that only the wise could keep, a balance between pride and caution, between strength and restraint. The wind carried stories of men who thought themselves untouchable, men whose names echoed in saloons only to be silenced in the dust of a single afternoon. Their legends flared bright and died fast, leaving nothing but cautionary whispers behind. Each town along the frontier knew such stories, and each traveler carried them like warnings etched into their bones. Yet, for all its cruelty, the West had a strange allure. Its desolation was a challenge, its silence a temptation. Men came seeking fortune, glory, redemption, or escape. Some sought to carve their name into history, to prove themselves against a land that had broken so many before them. The wide plains promised freedom, yet every step deeper into them demanded a sacrifice. Freedom here was bought in blood, and survival was the only currency that mattered. The cattle trails, the gold rush towns, the endless rail lines, all were built upon the backs of men who dared to gamble with fate, some winning fleeting riches, many losing everything. The land itself seemed alive, almost watchful. The desert winds carried not only dust but voices of the past, echoes of gunfire and cries that still lingered. The canyons stood like silent sentinels, bearing witness to countless tragedies and triumphs. At night, the stars burned brighter than anywhere else, yet even they seemed cold, detached from the struggles below. Campfires flickered like fragile hearts in the darkness, each flame a small rebellion against the void pressing in. Riders sat by them sharpening knives, oiling revolvers, staring into the fire as if it might answer the questions the land refused to. It was a place where even love was a gamble, tender moments rare and fragile as glass, constantly at risk of being shattered by violence. The saloon singer's smile, the promise in a stranger's eyes, the whispered vow made under the pale moon, all of it was precarious, as fleeting as morning mist. For at dawn, pistols would settle the truths that words could not hold. The West made sure every man knew what was truly at stake, and it demanded a price from all who dared to live beneath its burning sky. She stood before him with eyes that carried both fire and fear, her voice trembling not with weakness but with urgency, and she begged him to hold back. It was not a plea born from cowardice, but from love, from the knowledge that once a line was crossed there would be no turning back. Her words clung to the dry air like dust, pleading with him not to step into the circle that had been drawn by pride and sharpened by anger. She had seen what the land did to men who let arrogance blind them. She had watched too many fall to the call of violence, too many names carved into wooden markers that now leaned crooked against the wind. Her plea was not just for his safety, it was for his soul, for the part of him that was still whole, still untouched by the cruel hand of fate. Her voice cracked as she reminded him of promises made under quieter skies, promises whispered when the guns were holstered and the whiskey glass sat untouched. She reminded him that life was not measured only by victories but by the courage to walk away when every instinct demanded blood. She spoke not only to his ears but to the restless spirit within him, trying to tether it before it tore free and dragged him into the abyss. Her words painted a picture of another path, one where the horizon was not stained with blood, where silence did not end in gunfire but in peace. She was not asking him to surrender his honor, she was asking him to protect it in a way far more difficult than reaching for steel. Around them the world seemed to listen. The wind held its breath, the horses stilled their restless hooves, and the dust that hung in the air refused to settle. The townsfolk who had gathered in the shadows knew the weight of her words, even if none dared to speak. They had seen this moment before, had watched other women beg their men to stay their hands, to remember the love that still waited at home, the children that would cry if their father never returned. Some had succeeded, pulling a man back from the brink with nothing more than a trembling voice. Others had failed, their pleas swallowed by the roar of a gunshot, their grief carried away by silence too deep to fill. The town knew which fate hung over her now, but they also knew that once a man had set his mind to the duel, it was a storm not easily turned aside. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, not to hold him back by force but to remind him of what it felt like to be touched by something human, something alive and warm in a world that had grown cold. She reminded him of the nights when the prairie sky stretched above them, when he had spoken of dreams not drenched in violence, when he had believed in more than survival. She told him that pride would not cradle him in the dark, that victory would not whisper comfort when nightmares came. She told him that every bullet fired would echo long after the guns were empty, and that the weight of such echoes could crush even the strongest man. Her words flowed like a river trying to carve a canyon into stone, relentless yet fragile, desperate yet unyielding. The warrior's eyes flickered as he listened, caught between the fire in his chest and the voice that begged him to choose another road. He was no stranger to warnings. He had heard them before, from mothers, from friends, from strangers who saw the storm in his eyes. But her warning cut deeper because it was woven with love, and love has a way of reaching places pride cannot guard. For a moment, the hardness in his face softened, as though he could feel the weight of the life he might lose, not just his own but the life they could have built together. The circle in the dirt seemed smaller then, less a stage for victory and more a pit waiting to swallow him whole. The crowd shifted uneasily, some hoping her words would reach him, others knowing that a warrior's heart, once set ablaze, seldom heeded reason. Yet still she spoke, her voice steadying now, gaining strength from desperation. She told him that walking away was not weakness but wisdom, that true strength lay not in conquering others but in conquering oneself. Her eyes never left his, willing him to see the truth she offered, praying that for once the land's thirst for violence could be denied. She was the only barrier between him and the path that led to ruin, the only voice brave enough to call him back from the edge. Pride was the warrior's armor, heavier than the steel at his side and sharper than the edge of any blade. He carried it into every room, every dusty street, every shadowed corner of the frontier, as if it were the very thing that kept him alive. It was pride that made him lift his chin when insulted, pride that kept him standing tall when others might have bent, pride that whispered he could not turn away without losing more than a duel, without losing himself. Restlessness ran just beneath the surface, a ceaseless tide that would not let him stay still. Even in moments of quiet, when the world softened for a breath, he felt it gnawing at him, urging him forward, driving him into places most men avoided. It was not enough for him to survive, he needed to prove himself against the land, against the silence, against anyone who dared stand before him. The West was a cruel teacher, and it had taught him early that respect was won not through kindness but through fire. He had seen men walk with their heads low and their shoulders bent, and he had seen how quickly they disappeared into the dirt without a whisper. He refused to be one of them. To bend was to break, and so he let defiance harden in him like iron in the forge. Even when she begged him, even when her words reached deep, the fire inside him would not be tamed. To him, restraint sounded like surrender, and surrender was death long before any bullet struck. Pride told him that backing down was not survival but shame, that the eyes of the town, the whispers of men, and the judgment of his own reflection would weigh heavier than the grave. There was a hunger in him, not just for victory but for the proving of it. Each fight, each challenge, each narrow escape left him searching for the next. The restlessness was not a choice but a curse he carried. The silence of the plains drove him mad, the calm of ordinary life felt like a cage. When the horizon stretched out before him, he saw not peace but emptiness, and he sought to fill it with the sound of his own defiance. He was the kind of man who could not sit by the fire for long, who could not linger in the warmth of safety without feeling the itch of the unknown, the call of conflict. It was a hunger that had no end, for each triumph faded too quickly, leaving him once more unsatisfied, reaching for more. Men like him were both admired and feared. The townsfolk might nod when he passed, speak his name in hushed tones, but their admiration was always edged with unease. For they knew that pride this sharp cut in all directions, and that defiance unchecked could turn on anyone, friend or foe. They saw in his eyes a storm that could not be calmed, a storm that cared little for reason. Children watched him with awe, women with worry, and men with wary respect. He thrived on their glances, on the way silence stretched when he entered a room. It fed the fire within him, confirming what he already believed, that he was not a man to be ignored, that he was carved from harder stone than those who hid from the storm. He remembered every slight, every insult, every shadow of doubt cast upon him, and he carried them like fuel for the fire. Where others might have let the words of an enemy drift into nothing, he stored them, polished them, let them sharpen his resolve. Pride made every whisper a challenge, every glance a provocation. The restless spirit inside him refused to let such things pass. He could not let go, could not forget, could not forgive. To him, the world was a battlefield not just of guns and fists but of wills, and he could not bear to lose. When she pleaded with him, when her words trembled against the weight of his pride, he felt the pull of two worlds tearing at him. One was the world of warmth, of promises, of peace. The other was the world that had shaped him, the one where men measured themselves in blood and fire, where pride was worth more than life. He felt the stir of doubt for a moment, the faintest crack in his armor, but restlessness quickly sealed it. For in his heart he believed that to walk away was to be less, and to be less was worse than death. His defiance was not merely against the man who challenged him, but against the very notion that fate could dictate his steps. He would not be bound by pleas, not by love, not by fear. He was bound only by the fire within, and that fire demanded to burn. The decision came not with a roar but with a silence so sharp it seemed to slice through the very air. The warrior stepped forward, his boots pressing into the dust with a certainty that betrayed the war raging inside him. What might have been courage in another man became recklessness in him, for his choice was not tempered by wisdom but driven by pride and fire. The crowd that had gathered felt it before it happened, that shift from hesitation to resolve, from a chance of peace to the certainty of blood. She had begged him not to, her words still hanging in the air like fragile threads, but he tore through them as though they were nothing, his body answering to the hunger within rather than the reason she had given. The circle was drawn, and by stepping into it he had bound himself to a fate from which no man could escape. Courage should have been the strength to walk away, but to him it became the strength to stand and face the gun pointed at him. Recklessness wore the mask of bravery in his eyes, and he could not see the difference. The West had taught him that hesitation killed, that turning his back meant weakness, and so he chose forward, even when forward meant ruin. Every breath he took seemed heavier, the sun pressing down like a judgment, the dust rising in small clouds with each step as if the land itself was marking the path he had chosen. The townsfolk watched with a mix of awe and dread. They knew the look in his eyes, the hard set of his jaw, the way his hand hovered near the weapon at his side. They had seen men make this choice before, and they had seen how quickly life could be stripped away by a single flash of steel. To them, courage and recklessness were separated only by the outcome, and they knew that the West rarely showed mercy to those who mistook one for the other. Mothers clutched children closer, old men shook their heads, and younger ones leaned forward, hungry to see the fire of defiance blaze into action. The warrior was no longer just a man, he had become a spectacle, a lesson waiting to be carved into memory. The woman who had pleaded with him stood frozen, her heart pounding against the cage of her ribs, knowing that her words had not been enough. She saw not courage in his stance but the doom that pride had drawn over him. She wanted to run to him, to drag him back, but she knew that once a man crossed that line, no hand could reach him. He belonged not to her now but to the fire in his chest and the fate he had chosen. Her breath caught as she realized she was watching the unraveling of not just a moment but of a soul, the transformation of a man who could have walked away into one who would never be the same again. The challenger stood across from him, a shadow etched against the burning light of the sky. He too had chosen this path, but his eyes carried something different, something colder. He did not burn with pride as the warrior did, he carried calculation, patience, the steady rhythm of a man who knew how to wait for the mistake of another. In this duel, recklessness was not a weapon but a weakness, and the challenger saw it as clearly as the dust hanging in the air. Still, the warrior mistook his own fire for strength, mistook his defiance for destiny. He believed that the world would bend to the force of his will, but the West had no master, and it cared little for the pride of men. Each heartbeat in the silence was a drumbeat of inevitability. The warrior's breath quickened, his muscles coiled, his eyes locked on the man before him. Every part of him screamed that he was ready, that this was the moment he was made for, that his defiance would carry him through. Yet beneath it all was the truth he refused to see, that what he carried into this circle was not courage but recklessness, and recklessness had claimed more lives in the West than bullets ever had. The crowd could sense it, the woman could feel it, even the land seemed to whisper it, and yet the warrior pressed forward, blind to all but the fire that consumed him.